It was the night before everything changed, and I remember it as if the world itself had been holding its breath. The air smelled of sage and faint wood smoke, the kind that clung to my hair even after I'd washed it. The horizon burned with the last light of a prairie sunset, all copper and rose like the sky was blushing goodbye to the day. I sat on the porch steps, my bare feet brushing the cool dust, listening to the low, steady creak of the windmill and the quiet snort of horses in the corral. That was how peace sounded to me then. Wood sighing, wind whispering through tall grass, and the hum of life before darkness gathered. I didn't know that by morning, peace would be gone. Pa had gone to bed early, tired from mending the north fence line, and the lantern in his window was already dim. Ma had passed on 3 winters ago, and though I'd grown used to the silence she left behind, it still haunted the corners of our small ranch house. I'd grown used to doing chores alone, feeding the hens, bringing in wood, patching my dresses with crooked stitches. I told myself the solitude was strength. Sometimes, though, I'd watch the horizon and wonder if the world beyond those endless plains could ever hold more for me than this small life. I never imagined the answer would come the way it did. That night, a wind came down from the hills, sharp, restless, smelling faintly of rain. The horses grew uneasy, stamping their hooves, shifting like they sensed something I couldn't. I went to calm them, wrapping my shawl around my shoulders and carrying a lantern to the stable. Their eyes caught the light, wide and glassy, and I remember whispering to my mare, Daisy, "Hush now, girl. It's only the wind." But even as I said it, I wasn't sure I believed it. The night had a strange stillness, like sound itself had pulled back to listen. The stars shone clear and cold, and far to the west, I thought I saw a flicker, like a fire or maybe just a trick of my imagination. When I came back inside, I left the door unlatched, the way Pa always did so the night air could wander through. I sat by the table, brushing my hair out, my thoughts drifting like dust motes in lamplight. Sometimes I wrote little things in Ma's old journal, snippets of days, lines I'd half remembered from her hymns, feelings I didn't know how to speak aloud. That night I wrote, "The world feels heavy tonight, like it's waiting for something." I closed the book, blew out the lamp, and lay in bed listening to the hum of crickets outside the window. My eyelids felt heavy, but sleep came slowly. I remember thinking of the stories I'd heard in town, of riders seen in the hills, of a Lakota band moving quietly through the region, of settlers vanishing without a trace. Pa said it was foolish talk, the kind that men in saloons liked to pass around when whiskey loosened their tongues. I wanted to believe him, but I'd seen the way his eyes tightened when he thought I wasn't looking. Sometime near midnight, thunder rolled across the sky, low and distant. I turned over and pulled the quilt up to my chin, half dreaming of the storm. In my half-sleep, I imagined a campfire flickering in the dark distance, shadows of people moving around it, laughter like wind over the prairie. I didn't know if it was a dream or something else, something real, brushing close to the edge of my world. There was a moment right before dawn when I woke suddenly, my heart pounding. The air was still again. The crickets had gone silent. Even the horses made no sound. I sat up, listening, and felt that strange pressure, the kind of quiet that doesn't belong. I told myself I was being foolish, that Pa was just outside chopping wood as he sometimes did at sunrise. But then I heard it, the faint beat of hooves, far off but steady. Not one horse, but many. My breath caught in my throat. I rose and went to the window, pushing the curtain aside. The first streaks of morning painted the sky pale gold, and in that light I saw movement along the ridge, dark shapes against the horizon. My heart stuttered. Riders, maybe just travelers, I told myself. Maybe a trade party. But even as I reached for my shawl, I knew that no trade party rode in such silence. I remember waking Pa, the way he leapt from bed, reaching for his rifle before his eyes were even open. "Stay inside, Evelyn," he said. "Don't you move from that window." His voice trembled slightly, not from fear, but from knowing. There's a kind of knowing that only old men on the frontier have. The kind that comes from watching too many sunsets and hearing too many warnings. He stepped out onto the porch, the boards groaning under his boots. I watched from the crack in the curtain as the riders came closer, Lakota warriors painted and fierce in the rising sun. But even from that distance, one among them stood out. He wasn't shouting like the others or waving a weapon. He rode slower, taller, his dark hair braided, his eyes fixed not on our house but on the land around it. as though he were seeing it for the last time. The rest came fast after that, too fast to make sense of. Pa fired once into the air, maybe as a warning, maybe out of fear. The riders answered with a cry that cut through me like wind through dry grass. I remember the shattering of glass, the smell of smoke, the chaos that followed. I remember calling out for Pa and hearing nothing in return. And through it all I remember him, the tall one, the one who hadn't raised his weapon. He found me crouched behind the table, clutching Ma's journal like a shield. For a long, breathless moment we just stared at each other. His eyes were the color of river stones, gray with a hint of stormlight. He said something in Lakota, soft, almost like a prayer. I didn't understand the words, but I understood the tone. It wasn't cruelty. It was sorrow. When his hand reached toward me, I trembled. Not because of what he might do, but because of what I saw in his face. Something I couldn't name then. Something that later I would come to know as mercy. That was the last night I ever saw my home as it had been. By the time the sun rose fully, the smoke had cleared, and the world I knew had been taken by the wind. When the smoke finally thinned and the shouts faded into the distance, the world seemed to fall into a strange, echoing quiet. I remember the tremor in my knees as I was led away from the ruins of my home, the morning sun burning bright against the haze. My wrists were tied loosely with a strip of rawhide, but even then I could tell it was not meant to hurt. The knots were careful, soft enough that I could still move my hands. The Lakota riders formed a small circle around me, their horses gliding over the tall grass with ghost-like grace. Chayton rode ahead, tall and silent, the eagle feather in his braid stirring in the wind. He didn't look back, but I could feel the gravity of his presence, calm, watchful, like the world itself bent quietly around him. At first I told myself not to look at him, not to think, just to survive. The land spread wide and merciless before us, gold and green rolling into infinity, dotted with distant ridges and the faint shimmer of a river. I had never realized how small I was until then, a lone girl among endless sky. The other riders spoke little, their voices low, rhythmic like the hum of a song I didn't know the words to. Whenever I stumbled, a hand would steady me but never linger. And when the sun climbed high, they stopped by a creek shaded by cottonwoods. I stood apart trembling, not from the chill but from the hollow weight of everything I'd lost. That was when Chayton approached me for the first time. He held a water skin in his hands, its surface dark and worn smooth with use. "Drink," he said, just one word, his voice rough with the cadence of his tongue but clear enough for me to understand. My throat ached from thirst, yet I hesitated, unsure if this was a kindness or a test. He waited, unmoving, his expression unreadable. Then slowly he lifted the skin and poured a little water into his own palm, letting it spill onto the ground. Between us, a gesture I somehow knew meant it was safe. Only then did I take it. The water was cool and tasted faintly of leather, but I drank until I could breathe again. When I handed it back, our fingers brushed, a fleeting, accidental touch, but one that sent a strange warmth through me. As the days stretched on, I began to learn his rhythm, the way he moved with the land rather than against it. At dawn, he was always the first to rise, his silhouette outlined by the pink glow of the horizon as he checked the horses. He rode, with an easy stillness, the kind that made me feel both wary and oddly protected. When he spoke to the others, his voice carried quiet authority, and when he looked at me, there was no cruelty, only a kind of patience that unsettled me more than anger ever could. I'd been raised to think of men like him as savages, but nothing about him matched that word. One evening, after a long ride through a valley streaked with wildflowers, the group made camp near a bend in the river. The others laughed softly around the fire, their faces glowing amber in the light. I sat apart, watching the smoke rise to meet the stars. My wrists were no longer bound. I could have run, perhaps, but I didn't. Something in me had grown quiet, not from defeat, but from the strange calm that had begun to bloom where fear used to live. Chayton came over then, his steps soundless on the earth. He carried a small bundle of food, roasted rabbit still warm, and set it beside me. "You eat," he said. I looked up at him, at the way the firelight caught in his eyes. Why? I asked, my voice trembling. It was the first word I'd spoken since the raid. He tilted his head slightly as if weighing my question, then said simply, "You live." Something in the way he said it, not as an order, but as a vow, made my chest tighten. He crouched beside the fire for a while, silent, his gaze fixed on the flames. I found myself studying the lines of his face, the strong jaw, the faint scar near his temple, the gentleness in a man who could have been my ruin. He caught me looking once, and for the briefest moment, a ghost of a smile flickered across his mouth, not mocking, but almost tender. I looked away quickly, flustered, my pulse fluttering like a trapped bird. That night the wind turned cold. I tried to sleep curled against a fallen log, the thin blanket they'd given me no match for the chill. I must have been shivering because I woke to the soft rustle of movement beside me. Chayton had draped his own cloak over my shoulders, heavy and warm, smelling faintly of pine smoke and leather. I didn't dare move. I only lay there, my eyes open to the stars, listening to his steady breathing a few feet away. It wasn't safety, not truly, but it was something close enough that tears stung my eyes. Days passed like that, quietly, almost dreamlike. I began to understand bits of their language, the rhythm of their laughter, the songs they hummed while riding. Chayton spoke little to me, but when he did, his words were careful, deliberate, as if he feared they might wound if placed wrong. Once, while crossing a river, my horse lost footing and I nearly fell. In an instant he was there, his arm around my waist, his hand gripping mine with firm strength. I remember the shock of his touch, how time seemed to still, the world, narrowing to the sound of rushing water and his heartbeat beneath my ear. When I was steady again, he released me at once, his eyes dark and unreadable. That night, I couldn't sleep. I watched the embers glow low and thought of his hand, how it had held me, not as a captor, but as something else entirely. I didn't yet understand it, but part of me began to believe that beneath all the silence there was a thread connecting us, invisible but unbreakable, a kindness he didn't have to give and a trust I hadn't meant to feel. By the fifth day, I no longer thought of him as the warrior. He was Chayton, the man whose eyes found mine when words failed, whose quiet presence steadied a heart I hadn't realized was breaking. I didn't know where he was taking me or what fate waited beyond those endless plains, but I knew this. The world was changing inside me, and no amount of fear could undo it. When the riders finally slowed and the land opened into a small valley, I felt the first true breath of rest since the morning of my capture. The camp lay beside a bend in the river where cottonwoods leaned over the water, their leaves whispering like prayer. Hide tents stood in a rough crescent. Smoke rose thin and blue into the wide western sky. I expected shouting or stares, but the people who emerged to meet us were quiet. Curious, yes, yet not cruel. Children ran to the horses, laughing. An old woman offered me a bowl of water without a word. I was too stunned to refuse. Chayton dismounted and spoke briefly to an elder whose hair was white as the river foam. Though I couldn't understand the words, I heard respect in his tone, and something almost weary in the elder's reply. After a moment, Chayton turned toward me. "You stay here," he said gently, motioning to a shaded place near one of the lodges. "No harm." Then he walked away to tend the horses, leaving me with the old woman who had brought the water. Her name, I later learned, was Winyan Luta, Red Woman, for the color of her shawl. She spoke a little English and seemed pleased to find someone willing to listen. "You tired?" she said, touching her chest lightly. "Heart fast, you sit. You eat." She brought me a wooden bowl filled with stew that smelled of sage and roasted corn. My hand shook as I took it. The taste was unfamiliar yet comforting, warm, earthy, alive. As the day passed, I began to see patterns in the life around me. Women scraping hides near the river, men shaping arrow shafts, children chasing each other through the grass. Every movement had rhythm, purpose, belonging. No one treated me as a curiosity for long. They had their own lives to tend. I realized with a strange ache that the fear I'd carried so fiercely was beginning to soften, replaced by something quieter. Wonder, perhaps, or the simple need to understand. Chayton returned near sunset. He brought a bundle wrapped in deerskin, Fresh clothes for me, soft and clean. Yours, he said, setting them down. I didn't know how to thank him properly, so I only nodded. When I hesitated to take them, he added, "You free here, but not safe to go. Far tribes fight, you stay." There was no threat in his words, only fact and maybe a trace of concern. That night, the camp gathered around the central fire. The air smelled of cedar smoke and wild mint. Drums began to beat softly, a slow pulse that seemed to echo through the earth. I sat near the edge of the circle, the flames painting the faces around me in gold and shadow. Songs rose, low, mournful, beautiful. I didn't understand them, yet they reached something deep inside me, some longing I hadn't known I carried. Chayton sat across the fire, his gaze steady but kind. Once when the singing paused, he said quietly, "You think we ghosts, but we live." I swallowed hard, unsure how to answer. "I see that now," I said. He nodded once, a small smile flickering across his face. "You learn fast." In the days that followed, I did learn, slowly, awkwardly, but with a kind of hunger. Winyan Luta taught me the names of things, Emini for water, Feiji for grass, Thanka for buffalo. I repeated them until my tongue caught their rhythm. I helped grind corn, carried water from the river, and stitched torn hides under the watchful eyes of the women. Each simple task gave me a sense of purpose I hadn't expected. The more I worked, the less I felt like a prisoner, and the more I felt like a part of something ancient and wide as the sky. Chayton often passed nearby, quiet as ever, though I sensed he noticed every small change. The steadier way I walked. The way I no longer flinched when someone spoke suddenly. Once he found me struggling to lift a pot from the fire. Without a word, he stepped in and steadied it with a stick, saving me from a burn. Our eyes met for a brief moment. His expression held no triumph, only gentle amusement. "Slow," he said softly. "Fire waits." That small exchange stayed with me all day. There was no rescue to hope for, no way to undo what had happened, yet somehow the edges of my fear no longer cut so sharply. In its place grew a strange calm, the knowledge that survival could be more than endurance. It could be understanding. By late summer, I had begun to dream less of the ranch and more of the sound of the river, the laughter of children, the flicker of firelight on the hides of the lodges. Sometimes, when the wind shifted, I thought I heard Ma's voice in the trees, telling me that life finds its shape wherever kindness is allowed to take root. I still missed home fiercely, but the ache had changed. It no longer hollowed me out. It simply reminded me of who I was. One evening, a storm gathered on the horizon, dark clouds building over the ridges, thunder muttering in the distance. Chayton was repairing a bridle near his lodge when I came to return a basket I'd borrowed. "Storm coming," he said, glancing toward the sky. "Yes," I murmured, clutching the basket. "We used to say thunder was the sound of heaven talking." He smiled faintly. "We say same. Old voices." The simplicity of that, the way two worlds could share the same meaning without ever having agreed on it, filled me with quiet awe. I wanted to tell him how strange and miraculous it felt, but the words caught in my throat. Instead, I stood beside him and watched the first lightning flash across the far hills. The wind lifted the feathers in his hair and carried the smell of rain between us. For a moment, the world felt entirely at peace. When the storm finally broke, we both ran to help tie down the tents. Rain poured in silver sheets and laughter rose from the camp as everyone scrambled to save their belongings. It was the kind of laughter that comes when fear and joy mingle, wild and human. I found myself laughing too, soaked to the bone, my braid plastered to my back. And when the thunder passed and the fire was rekindled, I looked across the camp and saw Chayton smiling at me, not as a captor, not as a stranger, but as someone who had shared the same sky, the same storm. That night, lying beneath a borrowed blanket, I realized the valley had begun to feel like home. The world outside was still uncertain, full of dangers I couldn't name, but within the ring of that firelight there was warmth, and people who accepted me without asking for anything in return. For the first time since the raid, I slept without dreaming of smoke. The air changed before I knew what it meant. The days had begun to shorten, the light turning copper at dusk, and the wind carried the scent of dried grass and wood smoke. Life in the valley moved slower now, people gathering roots for winter, mending hides, tightening roofs against the coming cold. I should have felt content. Instead, a restlessness stirred in me, like the world was holding its breath. I had learned enough of their language to speak in small sentences. When I greeted Winyan Luta in the morning, she no longer laughed at my clumsy words. "You speak like river stones," she told me once. Slow but strong. I took it as a compliment. Chaitin was away more often now, riding with hunters into the hills. Each time he left, I told myself not to notice. Each time he returned, I failed. I would hear the hooves first, then the laughter of the young riders, and then I'd see him. Dust on his shoulders, hair braided back, eyes the color of smoke after rain. He always dismounted with that same quiet grace and always looked for me first, even if he didn't mean to. Once he handed me a small carved feather made from bone. "For luck," he said, "when you walk alone." I wanted to ask what he meant by alone, but his gaze told me he already knew that loneliness had followed me like a shadow since the day of the raid. One evening, as the sun burned low behind the ridge, I carried water from the river. The surface reflected the fire in the sky, red and gold, trembling. Chaitin was there mending a broken fishing spear. He looked up, and for the first time I didn't see the man who had taken me. I saw the man who had protected me from harsher hands, who had shared food when I couldn't eat, who had taught me the word peace. "Winter will come soon," he said. "I know," I answered. "It's strange." Back home, we'd be bringing in hay, patching the barn roof, getting ready for snow. He smiled slightly. "Same work here. Different songs." I sat beside him, careful not to spill the water. "Do you ever wish you lived another kind of life?" He thought for a long time before answering. "I wish for quiet days. No fighting. But wishes are like wind, they don't stay." There was something in his voice, something tired and tender, that made my heart twist. I wanted to tell him I understood, that I too was tired of fighting the shape the world had forced on us. But before I could speak, a hawk's cry cut through the sky. We both looked up. The bird circled once, then vanished over the ridge. "Bad sign?" I asked, half teasing. He shook his head. "No. Messenger." A shiver ran through me that had nothing to do with the chill in the air. That night, the camp glowed under a full moon. The drumming was softer now, the song slower. I watched the shadows dance across the tents, the light painting everything silver. Chaitin sat nearby, sharpening his knife. Every motion seemed carved into time itself. When our eyes met, something passed between us, unspoken, gentle, inevitable. It wasn't the sudden rush of stories. It was quieter than that, like realizing you've known someone your whole life without saying so. I remembered my father's words once. Love isn't always the wanting. Sometimes it's just the knowing. Later, when most of the camp had gone to sleep, I walked down to the river. The moonlight turned the water white, and the cottonwoods whispered like ghosts. I thought about the ranch, how my mother's hands smelled of flour and soap, how the porch creaked when Pa came in from the fields. I missed them still, but the ache had changed again. It wasn't a wound anymore. It was a scar, soft at the edges. Footsteps sounded behind me. Chaitin stopped a few paces away, respectful of the silence. "You walk far," he said. I couldn't sleep. "The river helps," he murmured. "It remembers everything." We stood together for a long time, listening. The wind lifted a strand of my hair. I didn't move it away. "Your people," he said finally, his voice low. "They come close." I turned sharply. "How do you know?" "Tracks. Scouts see fire in hills. Soldiers, maybe. Maybe ranchmen." The words hit me like cold water. "They'll come here?" He nodded. "Soon." Something inside me broke open. I thought of faces from home. Men who would not see mercy, who would not understand the kindness I'd been shown. They'd see only enemies. And if they found me here, I didn't know what I'd be to them anymore. "I'll talk to them," I whispered. "I'll make them see." Chaitin's gaze softened. "No, they will not listen. You stay with the women. Hide if fight comes." The thought of hiding while death swept through this valley filled me with terror and something else. Rage, maybe. Or grief. There has to be another way. He looked at me for a long moment, then said, "You have a good heart, Wichapi." I didn't know the word, but the way he said it, quiet, almost reverent, made me tremble. Later, Winyan Luta told me it meant star. I lay awake until dawn, watching the last stars fade. Somewhere beyond the ridges, thunder rolled, but it wasn't a storm this time. It was men, horses, guns. The wind carried the smell of smoke long before I saw it. The valley was still beautiful that morning. The river gleamed like glass. The cottonwoods rustled softly. The sky stretched endless and blue. But I knew with the certainty of a heartbeat that nothing that perfect lasts. Love, I thought, is a kind of stillness before everything changes. The morning came too bright, too still. I remember the smell of rain on the ashes of last night's fire, the laughter of children chasing a half-tamed dog through the grass, and then the sound that broke the valley apart. Thunder that wasn't thunder. The first shot cracked like a door slamming between worlds. Birds burst from the trees, horses screamed, and the river seemed to stop breathing. I dropped the pot I was holding and ran without knowing where. Smoke rose where the lodges had stood moments before. Men shouted in two languages, neither meant for peace. I saw Chaitin through the haze, calling orders, trying to gather the women and drive them toward the rocks by the river. I wanted to reach him, to tell him I understood what he had warned me of. But the world had become sound and dust. A horse bolted past, nearly knocking me down, and the next instant someone pulled me behind a fallen tree. It was Winyan Luda. Her face was calm, her hands steady. "Stay," she said. "He find you." Then she was gone. I never saw her again. The rest I remember in flashes, the smell of powder, the tearing of fabric, the roar of fear too big for words. I remember Chaitin's voice once more, shouting my name above the chaos, "Evelyn," and then silence. When I dared to rise, the valley was empty except for the smoke curling upward and the river still running, blind to what had happened on its banks. I found him near the water's edge at dusk. He was alive but wounded, breathing shallowly. I knelt beside him, pressing my hands to the earth because I didn't know how else to keep him here. His eyes opened and he smiled. That same small, quiet smile that had undone me long before. "Go," he whispered. "Your people come." "I won't leave you," I said, though even as the words left my mouth I knew I would have to. His fingers brushed mine, and for a moment the world held still again, as it had that first evening by the fire, when everything had seemed possible. He said one last word then, a soft Lakota phrase I didn't yet understand. "Wowa chung tognyaka." I learned its meaning years later. Kindness, generosity of heart. By the time the soldiers found me, I was sitting beside him, numb, his hand folded in mine. They said I was lucky. I didn't feel lucky. They asked where the others had gone, what had happened, but my voice was lost in the wind. They took me back to the settlements, to clean clothes, a doctor, the familiar language of fences and rules. My parents' ranch was gone, burned in another raid months before him, but a neighbor took me in. I married in time a kind man who built a small home on the edge of the plains. We had quiet years, good harvests. I told him only that I'd been a captive once and that some debts cannot be repaid except by living well. Still, on certain evenings when the light turns copper and the wind moves through the cottonwoods, I hear the valley calling. I go outside and listen for the river's voice, though it's 1,000 miles away. I see again the flash of the hawk, circling above, the curve of Chaitin's smile, the way his shadow bent toward mine. People say the past is another country. For me, it's a landscape I carry inside, a place of wild grass and thunder, where love was brief but real. I never returned to that valley. I never could. But every spring when the first rain falls, I whisper his name to the earth. Chaitin. It means falcon, the bird that never belongs to one sky for long. Sometimes I think he's still out there, in the wind that rattles the windows, in the cry of a hawk above the fields. And sometimes, when the sunset burns the horizon, red as embers, I close my eyes and imagine him by the river again, smiling as if nothing was ever lost. I tell myself he kept his wish after all. A quiet day, no fighting, the world at peace, and maybe in some small way so did I.